My name is Clara Vance, and for most of my 68 years, I have believed that a quiet life is a good life. I live in Charleston, in a small, clapboard house painted the color of a summer sky, a house that has held the entirety of my adult life within its walls. I was a first-grade teacher for 40 years, a profession that suited my patient and hopeful nature. I taught children how to read, how to be kind, how to see the magic in a story. I thought, in my quiet way, that I understood the architecture of a human heart. I was wrong. Nothing in my life of gentle routines and simple pleasures prepared me for the day my heart was dismantled, piece by piece, at my own son's wedding. The moment that redefined my past and redrew the map of my future did not happen in the shadows. It happened in the brilliant, late afternoon sun of a May day at Lowndes Grove, a historic plantation house on the banks of the Ashley River. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and salt marsh, a fragrance I had always associated with peace. My son, Leo, had dreamt of a wedding like this, one that spoke of old money and effortless grace, a world away from the modest home where I had raised him. I wore a dress of pale lavender silk I'd had made by a local seamstress. It was the most expensive piece of clothing I had ever owned, yet it felt homespun and plain amidst the sea of couture gowns that drifted across the manicured lawns. I felt a familiar, quiet anxiety, the old fear of not being enough, of somehow embarrassing my son. Leo looked like a stranger in his bespoke tuxedo, his sandy hair, once perpetually tousled, now sculpted into submission. When he'd greeted me earlier, his hug was brief, his eyes already scanning the crowd for more important guests. A coolness had settled between us over the years, a subtle frost I kept trying to melt with the warmth of my love, never realizing it was emanating from him. The incident, when it came, was a masterpiece of quiet catastrophe. The toasts were underway, the air shimmering with the clinking of crystal and polite laughter. I was holding a glass of Cabernet, my hand trembling slightly, not from age, but from the nervous energy of the day. As I shifted my weight to let a guest pass, my heel caught on an uneven flagstone. It was a small stumble, a minor loss of balance, but the result was spectacular. The red wine arced through the air like a scarlet ribbon, landing with impossible precision on the bodice of Genevieve's gown. Genevieve was Isabel's mother, a woman sculpted from marble and disapproval. The dress, as my new daughter-in-law Isabel would shortly announce to the entire assembly, was a vintage Chanel, a family heirloom valued at over $25,000. It was now defaced with a blooming, crimson stain. Genevieve let out a small, sharp gasp, looking down at her ruined dress as if she'd been physically wounded. For a moment, there was only the sound of the string quartet, then even that faltered into silence. "You foolish old woman!" Isabel's voice was not a shriek, but a low, venomous hiss that cut through the genteel quiet more effectively than any shout. Every head turned. Every eye fixed on me. "Look what you've done." My mind went blank with panic. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, fumbling in my purse for a tissue, anything. "Genevieve, it was an accident. Let me help." I reached out, my hand hovering over the stain. The slap was so swift, so unexpected, that I didn't even see it coming. Isabel's hand, adorned with a diamond the size of a robin's egg, struck my cheek. It wasn't a hard slap, not enough to leave a lasting mark on my skin, but it was executed with such cold, deliberate contempt that it seared itself onto my soul. The sound was a small, sharp crack in the vast, open air. "Don't you dare touch her," Isabel spat, her beautiful face a mask of fury. "You've done enough damage. Just get away from her." I stood there, my cheek tingling, my heart thudding a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. The world had narrowed to this one terrible point in time. 200 guests were staring, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a sort of horrified fascination. They looked at me as if I were a piece of trash that had blown into their perfect garden party. But the worst part, the wound from which I knew I might never recover, was Leo's reaction. My son, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose fevers I had nursed, whose dreams I had funded with the marrow of my own quiet life. He didn't rush to my side. He didn't defend me. He turned to his new father-in-law, a man of immense wealth and influence, and gave a small, apologetic chuckle. "That's my mom for you," he said, his voice carrying in the unnatural silence. Always a bit flustered in these situations. He shook his head, a gesture of fond, patronizing exasperation. It was a dismissal. A public disowning disguised as a charming anecdote. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it turned to dust and blew away on the jasmine-scented breeze. The carefully constructed edifice of my love for him, built over 30 years of sacrifice, collapsed into ruin. No one spoke to me. No one offered a kind word. I was suddenly invisible, a ghost at the feast. I saw Genevieve being led away by a concerned-looking attendant. Isabel was being comforted by a circle of friends, as if she were the one who had been assaulted. Leo was at her side, his arm around her, his expression a careful performance of husbandly concern. I turned and walked away. I moved through the clusters of silent, staring guests, my steps feeling heavy and strange on the soft grass. At the valet stand, a young man handed me the keys to my 10-year-old sedan with a look of such profound pity it was almost as painful as the slap. The drive home through the historic streets of Charleston was a blur. The familiar pastel houses, the grand porches, the ancient oaks draped in Spanish mosaic was a beauty I could no longer feel. It was a city built on appearances, and I had just spectacularly failed to keep up mine. My small, blue house felt cavernous and empty. The silence within its walls was different now, heavy with the weight of what I had finally been forced to understand. I walked into my living room, my sanctuary, and looked at the photographs that crowded every surface. Leo's first day of school. Leo at his high school graduation. Leo holding his college diploma. I was the one behind the camera in every shot, the unseen architect of his life, never a part of the picture itself. On the mantelpiece, the elegant, cream-colored wedding invitation stood propped against a stack of books. I had been so proud of it, so full of a foolish, hopeful joy. Now it looked like a writ of execution. I wasn't the mother of the groom. I was a liability, an embarrassing relic from a past he was desperate to shed. And the most devastating realization of all was that this wasn't new. The disrespect hadn't begun with a slap. It had been a slow erosion, a gradual chipping away at my worth that I had mistaken for the normal growing pains of a son becoming a man. But tonight, with the sting still lingering on my cheek and a hollow space where my heart used to be, I saw the truth. I was not Leo's mother anymore. I was simply a problem he had learned to manage. Sleep was an elusive stranger that night. I lay in bed, the moonlight striping the floor, and my mind, unbidden, began to excavate the past. The humiliation at the wedding was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of 1,000 smaller surrenders, 1,000 moments where I had chosen to be blind. Leo's father, a man with more charm than character, had left when Leo was 5. He'd kissed me on the cheek one morning and said, "I'm just not built for this, Clara," and walked out of our lives. I remember Leo, small and confused, asking every day when Daddy was coming home from his work trip. The lie became our foundation. From that day forward, my life's purpose narrowed to a single point: Leo. I wanted to be enough to fill the space of 2 parents. I worked my teaching job and took on after-school tutoring, grading papers late into the night until my eyes burned. When Leo showed an interest in sailing, a rich boy's sport, I sold my own mother's pearls to pay for lessons at the yacht club. When he decided he wanted to go to a private university up north instead of a state school, I refinanced my paid-off home, the house my parents had left me. My sacrifices were my secret love language. I thought he understood. But somewhere along the way, my giving became his expectation. My love became his asset. I remember his college graduation. I had saved for a year to buy him a beautiful, vintage watch, a classic timepiece I thought a young man starting his career should have. When I gave it to him, his smile was fleeting. "Thanks, Mom," he'd said, pocketing the box without opening it, his attention already on his friends who were calling him over. I later found it in a drawer, unworn, when I helped him move out of his dorm. Then came Isabel. He brought her home for Christmas his senior year. She was polished and perfect, the daughter of a prominent surgeon and a society hostess. She glided into my small house with an air of anthropological curiosity. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over my worn but comfortable furniture, my collection of well-loved books, my simple, home-cooked meal. "Your mother is so authentic," she'd said to Leo later, as if authenticity were a charming but curable condition. Isabel was brilliant in her campaign to separate him from me. It was never overt. It was a series of subtle, carefully placed suggestions. My therapist says that enmeshed family dynamics can really hold a man back professionally, she would mention casually. Or, "It's so important to curate your life, Leo. To surround yourself with people who elevate you." The calls home became less frequent. The visits shorter. When he spoke of his life in finance in New York, he used jargon I didn't understand, and when I asked questions, he'd sigh with a kind of weary patience, as if explaining things to me was a tremendous burden. After he graduated and began his career, the financial requests started. They were always framed as opportunities, as investments in his future. The first was for $20,000 in seed money for a tech startup a friend was launching. "It's a sure thing, Mom," he'd said, his eyes bright with ambition. "I'll pay you back double in a year." A year passed then too. When I gently inquired about it, he looked almost offended. "Mom, that wasn't a loan," he explained, his voice gentle, as if correcting a confused child. "That was you investing in me." I thought we were on the same page about that. I remembered the conversation differently. I remembered the word loan. But I let it go. To argue felt petty, unmotherly. I had trained myself to believe that my role was to give, not to count the cost. Then came the down payment for their first home, a stunning historic townhouse south of Broad. They needed another $50,000 to secure the mortgage. "Think of it as an investment in your future grandchildren's home," Clara, Isabel had said, her hand on my arm, her smile dazzling. The word grandchildren was the key that unlocked the last of my retirement savings. The thought of little ones, of a family restored, was a powerful anesthetic for the pain of writing the check. Each time I gave, I felt a little smaller, a little more diminished. My sacrifices weren't seen as acts of love, but as my designated function. I was the family ATM, the emotional backstop, the one who could always be counted on to absorb the cost, both financial and emotional. The wedding, I see now, was the final transaction. My contribution, another $15,000 for the honeymoon fund, had bought me a ticket to my own public shaming. I was not a cherished mother watching her son begin his life. I was a creditor who had been paid off with an invitation, and whose presence was now an inconvenience. Lying there in the dark, the past laid out before me like a series of damning exhibits, I finally saw the pattern. I hadn't raised a son who had simply grown selfish. I had raised a son who had learned, with his wife's expert tutelage, that I was a resource to be managed and exploited. My love had not made him strong, it had made him entitled. And my silence had given him permission to believe he was right. 3 weeks crept by. 3 weeks of a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence in my house. No call. No text. No perfunctory email of apology. It was as if I had ceased to exist the moment I walked away from the wedding reception. I moved through my days in a fog of grief. The garden I had always loved seemed overgrown and demanding. The books I tried to read held no comfort. My little blue house, once my haven, felt like a museum dedicated to a life that had been a lie. Every photograph of Leo was an accusation. One rainy Tuesday, unable to bear the sight of his smiling face any longer, I decided to clear out the old roll-top desk in my study. It was a task I'd been putting off for years, a clutter of old bills, school records, and sentimental papers. I needed something to do with my hands, a physical task to quiet the roar in my head. I worked my way through drawers filled with dried-out pens and ancient receipts. At the very back of the bottom drawer, I found a faded manila folder. The label, in my own neat cursive, read, Leo Financial. My hand trembled as I opened it. For years, my teacher's habit of meticulous record-keeping had been automatic. I'd kept everything, not out of suspicion, but because it was simply what I did. Now, I thanked that past version of myself. The first document was a promissory note, written on simple notebook paper, but signed in Leo's confident scrawl. I, Leo Vance, promise to repay my mother, Clara Vance, the sum of $20,000 for the purpose of a business investment within 24 months of this date. It was dated 8 years ago. It was not an investment in his future. It was a loan. A defaulted loan. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm. I dug deeper. There was the carbon copy of the $50,000 check for the house down payment. In the memo line, I had written, loan for down payment. There was another, smaller note for $5,000 he'd borrowed for what he'd claimed was an unexpected tax bill. But the final document was the one that stole the breath from my lungs. It was a copy of a page from their mortgage application, something Leo must have accidentally left behind after a visit. I had tucked it into the folder without much thought at the time. It was the section for disclosing liabilities and outstanding debts. And there, in black and white, typed into the form, was a line item, personal loan from C. Vance, $75,000. $75,000. He had acknowledged the debt to the bank to secure his own financing using my money as proof of his creditworthiness while simultaneously telling me it was a gift. The calculation was so cold, so deeply cynical, it made me feel physically ill. To the world, I was a bank. To me, I was a foolish old woman who should be grateful for the privilege of giving him everything I had. I sat on the floor of my study, the papers spread around me like fallen leaves. This wasn't just a series of misunderstandings or the casual selfishness of a grown child. This was a deliberate, long-term strategy of financial and emotional exploitation. My mind replayed other moments, other requests for cash that had been cloaked in the language of crisis. The time Isabel supposedly needed emergency dental surgery, a request for $8,000 that was followed 2 weeks later by her posting photos on social media of a shopping spree in New York. When I gently questioned it, Leo had been smooth. Oh, that was a gift from her parents, Mom. They felt so bad for her after her ordeal. The ordeal. The lies. I pulled out a notepad and a pen, my hand steady now. I started to add it up. The documented loans totaled $75,000. But then there were the other things, the endless emergencies, the cash for car repairs, the help with utility bills, the wedding contribution. I made a conservative estimate. Over the last decade, I had given my son well over $100,000. It was my entire nest egg. The money I'd carefully saved from my modest teacher's salary. My security. My dream of one day taking a river cruise through Europe. My peace of mind. All of it was gone, converted into bespoke suits, vintage Chanel, and a historic townhouse I was no longer welcome in. But the money, as staggering as it was, wasn't the deepest wound. The deepest wound was the betrayal of trust. He had studied me like a subject, learned my weakness as me guilt over his absent father, my deep-seated need to be a good mother, my loneliness, and he had used them as levers to pry open my heart and my bank account. I thought of all the times I had apologized to him. Apologized for bothering him about the money. Apologized for not having more to give. Apologized for being old-fashioned or out of touch. Each apology was a reinforcement of his power, a confirmation that my needs were secondary to his wants. I gathered the documents, my movements precise and calm. The grief was still there, a hard, cold stone in my chest. But something else was stirring beneath it, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to experience in years. It was anger. Not the hot, messy anger of a tantrum, but a clean, cold, clarifying rage. It felt like waking up from a long and debilitating fever. I had not failed as a mother. I had been robbed by my son. And for the first time since the wedding, I knew, with absolute certainty, what I had to do. The law firm of Sharma and Associates was located in a beautifully restored single house on Laguerre Street, painted a tasteful shade of sage green. I had chosen Anya Sharma from a list of attorneys because her biography said she specialized in family law and elder financial advocacy. It felt less like an attack and more like seeking counsel. Anya Sharma was a woman who radiated a calm, intelligent authority. She was younger than me, perhaps in her late 40s, with kind, dark eyes that missed nothing. I sat across from her at a polished mahogany table, the damning folder between us. "Mrs. Vance," she said, after she had read through every document with meticulous care, "this is an astonishingly clear record. Your son was thorough. Is that good?" I asked, my voice small in the quiet, elegant room. The act of being there felt like a monumental betrayal of the woman I used to be. "It is very good," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Legally, this is not ambiguous. These are not gifts that were later regretted. These are documented loans with clear terms, one of which he himself declared on a federal mortgage application. He owes you this money." She took out a small calculator. "Based on this paperwork alone, we're looking at $75,000 in principal. That doesn't include any of the undocumented cash you gave him, nor does it include accrued interest on the defaulted notes." The number, spoken aloud in that quiet room, felt both obscene and validating. "What are my options?" "We have a few," she said, leaning forward. "We can begin with a formal letter of demand, sent via certified mail. It will outline the debt and give him 30 days to arrange for repayment. If he ignores it or refuses, we file a civil suit." Given this evidence, she tapped the folder. "I am very confident of the outcome." She paused, her gaze softening. "I know this is difficult. He is your only son." "If I do this," I said, the words tasting like rust in my mouth, "our relationship is over. He will never speak to me again." Anya looked at me, a long, searching look. "May I be frank, Clara?" I nodded. "From what you've told me, and what these papers show, what kind of relationship do you have right now? He has taken your life savings, allowed his wife to strike you, and hasn't called in 3 weeks. You are not fighting to save a relationship. You are fighting to reclaim your self-respect. Sometimes, the only way to make someone respect you is to show them you are no longer willing to be disrespected." Her words landed like a bomb on a burn. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was a witness. She saw not a foolish old woman, but a woman who had been wronged. I signed the retainer agreement, my signature, for the first time in weeks, firm and clear. Walking out of her office into the Charleston sunlight, I felt a shift in my own internal weather. The heavy fog of shame and grief was beginning to lift, replaced by a clear sense of purpose. In the days that followed, while Anya drafted the letter, I began my own quiet revolution. I went to my bank and removed Leo's name as the beneficiary on my accounts, replacing it with the name of a local literacy charity I'd always admired. I changed my emergency contact at my doctor's office to my neighbor, Marian, a retired nurse and a sensible, kind woman. I took the photographs of Leo off the mantelpiece and the side tables. I didn't throw them away, I wasn't that strong yet, but I packed them carefully in a box and stored them in the attic. I wanted to see my own house, not a shrine to my own heartbreak. I bought a set of watercolor paints, something I hadn't touched since before Leo was born, and set up an easel by the window overlooking my garden. The silence from Leo continued, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like peace. It felt like space. The demand letter was sent on a Monday. Anya had read it to me over the phone. It was polite, professional, and utterly uncompromising. The 30-day clock had started. A week later, on a Thursday afternoon, my neighbor Marian called. "Clara, dear, there's a very fancy car parked out front, and a young woman is at your door. Says she's your daughter-in-law. Isabel." My stomach tightened, but with a different kind of tension now, not fear, but a strange, calm anticipation. "Thank you, Marian," I said. "Tell her I'm at the market and you're not sure when I'll be back." I wasn't at the market. I was in my garden, sketching the roses. I let her wait. I finished my sketch, washed my hands, and made a cup of tea. After a full hour, I opened my front door. Isabel was leaning against her pearl-white Mercedes, her arms crossed, her expression one of supreme annoyance. When she saw me, she rearranged her face into a mask of concerned sweetness. "Clara," she said, her voice bright and false. I was so worried. I've been trying to reach you. Have you? I said, my voice even. My phone seems to be working just fine. I left the door open and walked inside. She followed, her expensive heels clicking on my heart pine floors. She looked around my living room, her gaze lingering on the empty spaces where Leo's photos used to be. I came to apologize, she began, perching on the edge of my floral sofa as if it might be contagious. Things at the wedding, they got out of hand. It was a stressful day for everyone. Was it? I sat in my favorite armchair, the one that molded to my shape, and looked at her. Please do apologize. Her smile faltered. Well, too am sorry that things became so unpleasant. Unpleasant, I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. Is that what you call slapping your husband's mother in front of 200 people? Unpleasant? I would have chosen a different word. Assault, perhaps. A flush crept up her porcelain neck. You have to understand that dress. I understand perfectly, I interrupted, my voice still quiet. I understand that you value a piece of fabric more than you value a human being. I understand that my son stood by and let it happen. And I understand that this is not an apology. This is an excuse. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry that there might be consequences. Just then, the front door opened without a knock. Leo strode in, his face a thundercloud. He had been waiting in the car down the street, the backup she had called in. Mom, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. What is this? Izzy came here to make things right, and you're attacking her. Hello, Leo, I said calmly. How kind of you to finally visit. To what do I owe the honor? Don't play games, he snapped. We got a letter. From a lawyer. Are you serious? You're suing your own son. I'm not suing you, Leo, I said, standing up. I felt taller somehow. I am merely collecting on a series of loans you seem to have forgotten. Loans you had no trouble remembering when you listed them on your mortgage application. The color drained from his face. Isabel stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. It was clear this was a detail he had omitted from his version of the story. That was a misunderstanding, he stammered. No, Leo, I said, walking toward the door and holding it open. The misunderstanding was mine. I misunderstood my role in your life. I see it much more clearly now. I think it's time for you both to leave my house. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time in years. And in his eyes, I saw not love or remorse, but the cold calculation of a man who realized he had lost control of the board. They left without another word. As I closed the door, I heard him hiss at Isabel, I told you this was a bad idea. My phone began to ring minutes later. Leo. I silenced it and went back to my painting. The roses on the paper were beginning to look like real, living things. The 8 months that followed were a masterclass in emotional warfare. Leo, realizing his charm and intimidation tactics were no longer effective on me, turned his efforts elsewhere. He sent emissaries, aunts, uncles, old family friends all armed with stories of how I was tearing the family apart, how I was putting his marriage and career at risk, how my bitterness was destroying him. Each time, my response was the same, delivered with a polite but unbreakable calm. This is a private financial matter between my son and me. It is being handled by our attorneys. I let Anya handle everything. The barrage of calls from Leo's increasingly frantic lawyer, the lowball settlement offers, the threats of a countersuit for emotional distress. Through it all, Anya was my shield, a wall of calm professionalism that absorbed their chaos and left me in peace. I used that peace to rebuild my life. I joined the gardening club and discovered a passion for cultivating heritage roses. I took my watercolor class and found a quiet joy in mixing colors, in capturing the light on a leaf. I had coffee with my neighbor Marion every Tuesday, our conversations weaving a new tapestry of friendship and shared experience. I was building a life that was mine, a life that did not require my son's approval to be valid. The settlement conference took place on a cold, gray morning in a soulless downtown conference room. Leo sat across the long, polished table, looking tired and thinner than I'd ever seen him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His lawyer, a slick man with a practiced smile, began. My client, in the interest of family harmony, is prepared to offer a one-time payment of $30,000 to resolve this matter. Anya didn't even blink. Our position remains unchanged, she said, her voice crisp. The full principal of $75,000, plus interest and legal fees. The total is $103,450. We have the documentation to prove it in court, and frankly, Mr. Vance, the optics of a jury hearing about the wedding incident will not be in your favor. Leo flinched. The negotiation dragged on for hours. Finally, cornered and outmaneuvered, he agreed. He would liquidate some assets to pay me $60,000 immediately, with the remainder to be paid in monthly installments over 2 years, secured by a lien against his precious townhouse. As the lawyers drew up the final papers, he looked across the table at me, his eyes filled with a weary, grudging bitterness. Was it worth it, Mom? He asked, his voice low. To burn everything to the ground over money? I met his gaze, and the words came to me, not from a place of anger, but from a place of profound and sorrowful clarity. It was never about the money, Leo, I said softly. It was about the respect. And it wasn't me who burned everything down. You did that. I just stopped pretending I didn't smell the smoke. The first check arrived a week later. The monthly payments that followed were always on time. They were transactions, cold and impersonal, and with each one, I felt a piece of my stolen security returning. I used the initial payment to do something I'd never allowed myself to do. I booked a 2-week trip, not to Europe, but to the coast of Oregon. I went by myself. I walked on windswept beaches, hiked through forests of giant firs, and sat in cozy cafes, writing in a journal and painting the wild, dramatic landscapes. I spoke to strangers, and for the first time in my adult life, I introduced myself not as Leo's mother, but simply as Clara. A year after the settlement, my life had found a new, quiet rhythm. My friendship with Marion had deepened into a sisterhood of the heart. My garden was a riot of color and fragrance. My paintings, which I'd begun showing at a small local gallery, were selling. One afternoon, Marion mentioned she'd seen Leo's car drive slowly down our street a few times in the past month. He never stops, she said. Just drives by. Maybe he wants to see you, she suggested gently. Maybe, I said, pruning a deep crimson rose. But reconciliation requires more than a drive-by, Marion. It requires remorse. And I'm not sure he knows what that is. I wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness had dissolved, leaving behind a kind of tender scar tissue. I felt a deep, abiding sadness for the son I had lost, or perhaps the son I had never truly had. But it was a sadness that no longer defined me. On my 70th birthday, I sat on my porch with Marion, sipping iced tea and watching the evening light turn the sky to shades of apricot and lavender. The house was filled with the scent of the night-blooming jasmine I had planted. I looked at my small, beautiful world-me garden, my friend, my peaceful home, and I felt a contentment so deep and steady it was like the tides. Somewhere across town, Leo was living his life. I hoped, in a distant and detached way, that he was happy. But his happiness was no longer my responsibility. Mine was my own. The final payment had arrived last month, accompanied by a sterile note, paid in full. He was wrong, of course. Some debts can never be fully repaid. But I had come to understand that some things, like freedom and self-respect, were priceless. And for the first time, I felt truly, completely rich.